Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Sam's33 here, and welcome to my new Card of the Day series. These videos are just a quick little thing I can put out every other week or so, because the videos I've been making recently, Mix Up and Last Life, have been taking a lot of effort, and I don't think I can keep doing them every week. That said, this series is your standard Card of the Day series. I look at a specific card and what I think of its worth in certain decks, or in some cases, its own deck, and give it a rating from 1 to 10. 1 being unusable, 5 being not much of an opinion, and 10 being a 4 of in every deck. Today's card hasn't seen as much play as it used to, but it's still prevalent in our current format. That card is Pokémon Pokémon Catcher. The reason for its decline in play is really obvious, and that's because back when Legendary Treasures came out, the card was errata'd to make it worse. The original effect was simply switch the defending Pokémon with one of your opponent's bench Pokémon. The new wording requires you to flip a coin, and if heads you do the effect on the card. You can imagine why this card was errata'd. When this card didn't require a coin flip, the format was turned on its side. Games became incredibly fast and encouraged aggression in almost every scenario. It was difficult to come back from going down a few prizes because your opponent would usually be able to take their last prizes from something on your bench, and because it was so good, every deck had to play 3 or 4 catcher. Once the errata hit, the format got a lot better. Slower decks started popping up a lot more, there was more variation in deck lists, and games became much more skill-based. But enough about the past. Time to look at how good this card is now. The card is still very good, if you flip heads. Obviously you're going to flip tails some of the time, and it's going to be useless. If you really can't stand coin flips, catcher isn't going to turn you. But what if you're just the slightest bit partial to them? Well, let's take a look and see if it's worth the risk. Ever since catcher has seen a decline in play, a lot of players have taken advantage of this in several ways. One was by playing slower evolution decks. If your opponent wasn't playing catcher effects, you could safely set up a stage 1 or stage 2 on your bench without fear of it getting knocked out. Cards like Sigilyph and Suicune also became a lot more popular due to it being harder to get around that annoying safeguard ability. Catcher is not actually that great at countering either of those strategies, since you usually won't draw enough catchers that early on, and won't flip enough heads to make much of a difference against evolutions or safeguard Pokemon, since they can just set up more evolutions or send up the safeguarder again. No, where catcher really shines is in the end game. It's best to save your catchers for when you absolutely need them. If you save them all until you need them, you're bound to flip at least 1 heads. You definitely don't want to waste catchers when you don't have to. For example, if your opponent devotes all of their resources to one of their bench Pokemon, that would be a good time to play a catcher. If you're going to use it to bring up a Deoxys EX as opposed to a Thundurus EX on your first turn, that would be a waste of a catcher. Obviously, with cards like Juniper and Bicycle in the format that force you to play everything in your hand when you draw it, saving your catchers isn't always an option. But when you do have the option, it's a great thing to take advantage of. Now, going back to those heavy setup evolution decks and safeguard Pokemon, while catcher isn't great against these things early game, late game catcher can come in handy. If you're running out of non-EX Pokemon late game and don't run catcher, safeguard will cause serious problems for you. And for setup decks, late game they can send up useless Pokemon while they build up their one Pokemon that can get them the win. This can also happen to decks that run catcher, if they happen to burn through all their catchers early on. This is why it's usually better to save your catchers for dire situations. As soon as you're out of catcher effects, a smart opponent can play around that and take advantage of how linear your deck has become. So looking in a vacuum, catcher is a good card. But how does catcher work when played in the correct decks in the format? Let's take a quick look at some decks that catcher can work pretty well in. Yveltal with and without Garbodor is a very good home for catcher. The deck is very aggressive and will very likely be the first player to set up, so catcher is great for stopping your opponent from setting up or ending the game as quick as possible. Sableye also combos very well with this card. If your only way to win is to catcher a specific Pokemon, you can just junk hunt for 2 catcher, and you'll likely hit 1 heads and be able to win. The Garbodor version may not have the space, but I highly recommend the card in the regular version. Blastoise and Raybor may not seem like good decks to play catcher in, but it does have some specific uses in the deck. The Dragon EXs are really only good at knocking out EXs, so catcher is good for bringing those out and blowing them to smithereens. The decks are also very bad at dealing with safeguard. Catcher lets you get around them and still use your 200 damage dealing EXs. And finally, Palkia EX is not fun for this deck, and combos well with Safeguard. Without Catcher, the card will wreck all of your Black Kyurms with ease. With Catcher, you can knock out Palkias just as easily as they can knock out Black Kyurms. Raybor is a little tighter on space than Blastoise, but Catcher works well in both decks. Plasma is another aggressive deck that Catcher can work pretty well in. Catcher might seem unnecessary, since you can play Genesect EX in Plasma decks, but Genesect has a few flaws simply as a Catcher effect. For one, you have to use your attachment for the turn to use its ability, which may not be an option a lot of the time, especially when using Lugia EX, which discards your energy every time you attack. Even when using other attackers, that can be a pain. It also takes up bench space, which can be very valuable to Plasma decks, what with all the Deoxys you need on the field and all the different attackers that Plasma can play. Because of Genesect's flaws, Catcher isn't that bad of a substitute, but to be honest, I haven't really tested Catcher in Plasma decks, so I'm not really sure which is better. We also have to remember that in the new set, we're getting a card that has a very similar effect. That card is Lysandre. It's a supporter that automatically switches the defending Pokemon with one of his or her bench Pokemon, so pretty much Catcher without a flip. So the question is it worth it to play Catcher? The answer is, depends. For aggressive decks that need to draw cards every turn and can't afford to use their supporter on Lysandre, Catcher is probably better. For decks that build up to an eventual setup, or needs that Catcher effect so badly that it can't risk the flip of the item, Lysandre will suit them nicely. Lysandre also takes up less space. If you're aiming to get that Catcher effect once per game, you'll need either one Lysandre or two Catcher. It also heavily depends on your playstyle. Do you prefer the inconsistencies of coin flips or supporters that don't draw you cards? So I think both cards have their place in the format, depending on the deck and the player style. Genesect and Ninetales are two other cards that have the Catcher effect, but I feel unless you're using them for their attacks, or in Genesect's case, if you're already playing Plasma Energy, Catcher and Lysandre are usually the way to go. So now it's time to give Pokemon Catcher a rating. I'm going to give it a respectable 7 out of 10. Catcher is pretty solid in the right decks, and I definitely don't see Catcher dying out anytime soon. To put it simply, its effect is just too strong not to have it appear in tournaments. But those painful games where you flip all tails is what keeps it from getting a higher score. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you all like this new series. Let me know down in the comments if you enjoy this series or not, or anything you think I need to improve on this show. Or just give it a like or dislike to save you some time. Next time on Card of the Day, whenever that is, I'll be talking about one of my favorite Queen songs. Also a Pokemon card. Later.